This is all Indian land. All of it. Every single part. This is Turtle Island, if you don't know. All of it. So-called Canada and America.
I'm going to show you how Prime Minister Mark Carney and BC Premier David Eby have become involved in a series of Indigenous land claim controversies that could fundamentally reshape who controls and owns land in British Columbia. But there's one development in particular that has completely changed the way that I've looked at this story. And once you understand what is really happening in British Columbia and the role that David Eby and Mark Carney are playing, all the dots become connected. And once you see the implications that all of this is going to have, not just on British Columbians, but also on Canadians, on property rights, on pipelines and natural resources and more, you won't be able to look at this issue the same way again. Because yes, this is much bigger than it first appears. My name is Cantin-Nantel. Welcome back to the podcast. Before we get started with today's show, be sure you are subscribed, hype and like the video, hit the notification bell, and consider getting a paid channel membership for less than $5 a month because we don't take a dime in subsidies from the federal government. Journalism and commentary 1 year anniversary.
I don't believe journalism being funded by the government is the solution.
Rebuild the foundation. You have to retell the stories.
Market conservative
Other news that actually matters.
I hence wanted to ask. I think they should answer their questions, especially if they're politically charged with. Part 1, the massive transfer. So a few days ago, it was revealed that the BC government, which is led by David Eby and the NDP Socialists, are anticipating to transfer 135,000 hectares of land to First Nations. And for your information, 135,000 hectares is 300,000 acres. So a lot of land. So reading here from Sitka Media, in newly released documents, the BC government has revealed 135,425 hectares of provincial crown land that is anticipated to be transferred to 20 First Nations bands. The numbers were released in the public accounts for 2025-26 and were first identified by independent BC journalist Bob Mackin. And here you can see a tweet from Bob Mackin with further information about the land transfer. Continuing to read here from Sitka Media, the largest transfer is nearly 46,000 hectares to the Kitsukalum, which is located near Terrace, followed by 35,000 hectares to the Kitsalas. An hectare is equivalent to 10,000 square meters. So a lot of land here we're talking about. The public account specifies that there will also be implementation costs, which, quote, may result in compensation to third parties, but adds that those costs, quote, are not determinable at this time. The disclosure also notes that the transfers are specific to those First Nation bands that have willingly entered into negotiations with the provincial government and do not include potential land transfers coming about from litigation. In addition, the disclosure does not include any federal crown lands that may be transferred. So this is just BC on its own, and that matters because as you're about to see, there's so much more. Among the land that David Eby wants to give to First Nations is pretty significant territory in Victoria, which is British Columbia's capital. So reading here, an internal BC document has revealed the extent of the province's plan to cede over 100,000 hectares of crown land to First Nations, including prominent landmarks around the provincial capital of Victoria. The total proposed cessions are more than twice the size of the city of Toronto or 300 times the size of Vancouver's Stanley Park. What more, they would all become quote-unquote treaty lands, a special territorial designation that is not subject to local zoning control. In the case of Victoria, this means that some of the most prime development land in the city could become Indigenous controlled properties exempted from local bylaws, approvals, and building codes. Quote, local government bylaws do not apply on treaty lands, reads a May 2024 consultation paper published by the BC government. That same document warns that the land transfers may, quote, take some time getting used to. You see, law-abiding Canadians, you may need to take some time to get used to the new normal brought to you by the BC-NDP and the Liberal Party of Canada, and adds that the land that becomes treaty land could end up being sealed off from public access. Quote, once those lands become treaty lands, there may be limited access or even no access for public use. So you see land that you and I, as Canadian taxpayers, as law-abiding citizens, were previously able to go on. Now suddenly, no. This is treaty land. And the access, the rules are no longer the same. So over here, you see some of the land that is being proposed as land to be given away. So as you see, some prime waterfront, as well as lots of green space, all poised to be just given away to First Nations. One BC government outline on modern treaties, published in 2023, explained that one of their primary goals is, quote, return lands to First Nations. So basically, this is a full-on admission that the BC NDP wants land back. They want to take land that belongs to us, and they want to somehow give it back. Land back is the plan here. And at whose cost? Well, at the cost of the taxpayer, the law-abiding Canadian citizen, of course. In many of the transfers, First Nations stand to receive territory well beyond the size of their existing reserve land, and unlike these reserve lands, these would effectively be held as fee simple territories. And amongst the most valuable cessions is 1,916.7 hectares of land set aside for the Tuamix Treaty Association, a collection of 5 First Nations on southern Vancouver Island. Continuing here, one of the most notable properties within the Tuamix package is Hatley Castle, a 1908 Colwood estate best known for its role in the X-Men film franchise. Under terms being negotiated by the BC government, it would become a fee simple possession of the 600-member Songhees First Nation. So they basically want to give this humongous castle over to a group of First Nations in the name of reconciliation. The Songhees would also take possession of 2 parcels of land in downtown Victoria, including a parking lot across from the BC Parliament buildings, with an assessed value of $24.8 million and a nearby waterfront parking lot assessed at $22.5 million. As treaty lands, both parcels could be developed without City Council oversight, a good analog being the recently completed Sencow development in Vancouver, a compound of skyscrapers comprising 6,000 rental units that was able to exceed the usual local controls on density due to it being located on First Nation land. Now, this seems bad enough, but there's even more. Reading here from Carolyn Findlay, the leader of the BC Conservative Party, she warns that this is just the beginning. Reading this statement, BC Conservatives warn of actual First Nation land transfer the size of Portugal or South Korea. And the BC Conservatives claim that with the other potential arrangements that are being considered, we could be looking at as much as 24 million acres or 9.6 million hectares of crown land being given away to First Nation tribes. Just think about this, 24 million acres of land being given away. Part 2, the $1 trillion land claim. One of the sticking points of all of these land giveaways, these land claims, these land grabs, is the amount of money that's at stake. There's another land dispute happening in British Columbia, and it involves a significant portion of land on territory that has $1.3 trillion worth of gold, silver, and copper. So reading here from Juno News, Tahltan Nation seeks title over BC's $1 trillion mineral heartland, otherwise known as the Golden Triangle. The BC government is quietly negotiating one of the largest transfers of Crown authority in provincial history, recognizing legally unproven Aboriginal title over 11% of British Columbia. The Northern Beat first revealed the negotiations in a weeks-long investigative series. The quote-unquote foundation agreement seeks to recognize Tahltan Nation rights and title over its entire legally unproven 96,000 square kilometers territorial claim according to public and FOI documents obtained by the Northern Beat. The foundation agreement negotiations will be based upon recognition of Tahltan Aboriginal title and rights in Tahltan territory, states the 2020, quote, shared prosperity agreement, defining the territory as, quote, the traditional territory identified by the Tahltan. The claim covers a large landmass, larger than Portugal, including 70% of the Golden Triangle, one of Canada's richest mineral regions, with an estimated 1.28 trillion, or 1.3 trillion if we want to round up, worth of metals. So we're talking about like super prime land here. After meeting with the premier last November, the Tahltan said the agreement would embed consent-based and shared decision-making over resource, land, and environmental governance. Ottawa appears to share that goal. A July 2 agreement commits the federal government to supporting the Tahltan Foundation Agreement through separate agreements or other arrangements. Although the Foundation Agreement remains unsigned after 6 years of negotiations, the BC NDP has already granted the Tahltan unprecedented consent-based authority over approvals for the multi-billion-dollar SK Creek and Red Chris mining project. Furthermore, the article notes that Section 7 of DRIPA, which is a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act, a radical piece of land-back decolonial legislation that was passed in BC, allows consent-based agreements requiring an Indigenous community's approval for projects on its claimed territory without first proving the claim in court. Withholding that consent can effectively amount to a veto. And what does the BC NDP have to say about people who are concerned legitimately about all of this? Well, you guessed it. They labeled reasonable concerns as conspiracy theories. Reading here, when opposition critic Scott McInnes asked about the secret Tahltan Foundation agreement in May, Indigenous Relations Minister Spencer Chandra Herbert dismissed the question. Quote, this process has actually been underway for quite a number of years. So I would encourage the member to try and use Google more than to use conspiracy theories. So just to be clear here, the BC government, the NDP, whose MLAs have used the term settler, colonizer, and uninvited guests to refer to non-Indigenous British Columbians, the government whose leader, socialist David Eby, has referred to British Columbia as the original colonial mistake, and whose government had guidelines that suggested that the phrase British Columbian was exclusionary, while they're calling you a conspiracy theorist because you are noticing that they are in negotiations and they're actively looking to give away large amounts of land. That should concern the heck out of you. It certainly does out of me. Because remember, all the previous times that they called us conspiracy theorists, they ended up being proven wrong and we've been proven right. How many times have the conspiracy theorists been proven right? Is this going to happen again? Well, we shall see, I guess. Now, reading further from friend of the show, Lauren Gunter in the Edmonton Journal, DRIPA is expected to be used more frequently in the future to halt mega projects. This might seem like a BC-only problem, but it has implications for trade from the rest of Canada to Asia. If BC First Nations feel empowered and have the control of enough land, then they may stand in the way of not just pipeline and diamond mines, but the expansion of export, ports, and rail line. And all of this is based on the BC NDP's mistaken belief that all land in the province was stolen from colonists. Remember, when they claim that BC is unceded land, when they do their land acknowledgements, when they speak in favor of decolonization and land back, that doesn't come without consequences. Part 3, Carney's Land Controversies. A lot of what we've been talking about so far involves David Eby and the BC NDP, but Mark Carney and the federal Liberals are also involved in this land scandal. Earlier this year, the Carney government signed a pretty significant agreement with a First Nations band that involved the city of Vancouver. Reading here from the Daily Hive, Government of Canada's landmark agreement recognizes Musqueam First Nations Aboriginal title in Metro Vancouver, Control over fisheries, marine planning, and emergency response along parts of the south coast of British Columbia will increasingly be shared with the Musqueam Indian Band under 3 new agreements signed with the Government of Canada. More importantly, the deals will formally recognize Musqueam Aboriginal rights and establish a framework for joint governance in the First Nations traditional territory. These agreements are being described by both sides as a political step towards implementing Aboriginal rights under the Canadian Constitution, according to a news release. It should be noted here that the full details of the term and the agreement, they were not made immediately known to the public. So the government was basically trying to hide this from people. But as noted here, the Rights Recognition Agreement was by far the most consequential, as it recognized that Musqueam had Aboriginal rights, including title to their traditional territory, and established a framework for incremental implementation of rights and nation-to-nation relations with Canada. In simpler terms, this meant the federal government formally acknowledged that the Musqueam hold Aboriginal rights, including Aboriginal title on land within territory, and that it is committed to work out step by step how those rights will be put into practice. So basically, they are saying that parts of Vancouver are now Aboriginal land. That's a way to put it. The traditional territory, well, that includes the region's mountain forest watershed that feeds into Metro Vancouver's drinking water reservoir, as well as West Vancouver, North Vancouver District, Vancouver, the University of British Columbia, the University Endowment Lands, Burnaby, Port Moody, and more, Balcarra, Coquitlam, New Westminster, Richmond, Vancouver International Airport, and the northern areas of Delta and Surrey and the waterways. And it also overlaps with several other First Nations. Mark Carney's Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, she said that, quote, reconciliation is not words, but action. So you see this land deal here, that is part of reconciliation. This is land back. This is decolonization in action. This is what it looks like. And perhaps most concerning is that Mark Carney's Vancouver land agreement doesn't protect private property rights. So reading here in the National Post, this agreement is not just about holding talks, it also includes clauses about the presumption behind those talks. Those include a recognition by the Government of Canada of Musqueam's rights and title within the large area covering much of Metro Vancouver. And this potentially looks very significant when Aboriginal title is an exclusive ownership right, and most of Metro Vancouver already has people in it. The article notes that the word within does not mean all, and that some people had misinterpreted the agreement at the time. But on the other side, the claims by proponents of the agreement that it has no effects on private property is not accurate either. The agreement does not contain any clause referencing private property rights, and its defenders have now said that this is because the federal government cannot change property rights. There is a constitutional logic to the last part of this statement, but what the federal government has done is put an additional cloud over private property rights through much of Metro Vancouver and entered into an agreement that operates based on ongoing threats to private property. Now, the Musqueam tribe have said they're not looking to take back land from individual homeowners, but much of their leverage and ongoing discussion based on the agreement comes from ongoing underlying threats in relation to private property. So basically, Mark Carney here is radically undermining property rights and doing so in one of the most populated areas of the country in the name of reconciliation and decolonization at a time where there's already massive threats to property rights, again in the name of reconciliation and decolonization. And they thought they could get away with it by announcing this quietly. Part 4, why this is happening. There are Indigenous people all across the country, yet the land stories seem to primarily be in British Columbia. Now, why is this? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. It's because of incompetent politicians. Reading here in the National Post, shortly after British settlers established the colony of Vancouver Island, the Governor James Douglas signed a flurry of treaties with the region's First Nations to secure land for fur trapping, mining, and other activities. Known as the Douglas Treaties, these 14 agreements might have seemed like a template for future agreements with British Columbia's Indigenous peoples who occupied land stretching from modern-day Vancouver to the northern border with Yukon. Instead, the province stopped signing such agreement, a result of the Hudson's Bay Company's refusal to continue funding negotiations, and reach virtually no other treaties for the next 150 years. The absence of such land agreement has left British Columbia with a patchwork of unresolved, overlapping, and highly complex land claims that persist to this day, a legal headache that the province only recently began to address. Indigenous people still claim the right to around 80% of BC's lands. Kent McNeil, who's an Indigenous law expert at York University, said, quote, BC really created this problem for itself by not entering into treaties back then, and that's why there's these massive land claims. The scope of the province's situation makes it unique in Canada. While Ontario, the prairie provinces, and other governments sign treaties with the majority of their First Nations, BC simply coasted along as British immigrants settled on non-treaty lands. Between then and now, British Columbia, and by extension Canada, has suffered incalculable social, legal, and economic damages. Never-ending court challenges have continued to sap public resources, while a lack of clarity around title rights has interrupted critical investments like mines, pipeline, and port expansions. And it is also this lack of treaties, these lacks of agreements, that have resulted in the Cowichan decision, which we covered previously on this show. A little recap of this case, the Cowichan case, it was in August 2025, and the decision by the judge said that Aboriginal title claims may take priority over private property ownership, and that puts some people's property in jeopardy. And this remains unresolved, by the way. The Supreme Court refused to hear an appeal to a similar case in New Brunswick that had found that Aboriginal title could not apply to private property. But by refusing to hear it, that doesn't mean case is closed. This case in Cowichan will have to also go to the Supreme Court. And let's remember that the Liberals under Trudeau packed the Supreme Court with radical leftists. Something else that should be noted is the way that these new agreements are being done is not in the same way they were traditionally done, but rather through globalist United Nations principles. Reading here, in recent years, the federal and BC governments have begun adhering to legal interpretations that recognize Indigenous title claims with a wider scope than traditional treaty agreements did. Guiding those efforts is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP, a directive that aims to restore Indigenous peoples' lands and right to self-determination. BC first adopted UNDRIP legislation in 2019, that's also known as DRIPA, and then the Trudeau government, they passed their own version. While the principles behind UNDRIP seem like a compassionate effort to correct historical wrongdoings, its real-world implementations appear to contradict Canada's inherent interest as a sovereign nation, according to Thomas Isaac, chair of the Aboriginal Law Group at Castle's law firm. Someone who's also appeared on the channel. Isaac, who's an expert on this topic, called it such a self-destructive move by Canada. So to summarize, in my view, this is a scandal. We're talking about humongous amounts of land worth a lot of money just being given away. We're talking about making deals not with the traditional principles, but with the globalist UN principles of UNDRIP. We're talking about undermining property rights. And many of these decisions are not being made with transparency. And beneath a lot of this is a leftist ideology that Canada is an illegitimate settler colonial state, and that the remedy to past wrongdoings is to decolonize and take part in land back, even though this comes with tremendous consequences for the nation of Canada. So this sums up today's show. I hope you were able to better understand what is happening in BC right now, which is a very concerning issue, if you ask me. If you believe that Eby and Carney need to stop the land back agenda, then sign the petition in the comments below. And we will see you again very soon. And until then, God bless.